My name is Edith Reynolds. I'm in my early 40s, and for most of my adult life, I've been known as the dependable one. The woman who doesn't panic, the one who has it handled. I work with systems and people, I manage details others don't want to think about, and I've built a life where calm is often mistaken for ease. People usually see me as composed, practical, and emotionally steady. Someone who doesn't need much. Someone who won't make things difficult. I've heard variations of the same sentence for years. Edith is strong, she'll be fine. And most of the time, I was. Or at least I learned how to look like I was. This isn't a story about drama or betrayal in the cinematic sense. It's not about shouting matches, slammed doors, or public reckonings. It's about something quieter, about absence, about what happens when you realize that being reliable has slowly turned into being overlooked, and how silence, when chosen deliberately, can change the balance of a life. My husband left me alone during a hospital visit, until I stopped waiting. I want to be clear about what this story is not. It's not an attack. It's not revenge. It's not a performance of strength designed to humiliate someone else. What I'm sharing is honest, restrained, and intentionally undramatic, because that's how the truth often arrives. Quietly, without asking permission. Over the next hour, I'll walk you through how I was perceived, the role I slipped into without realizing it, and the moment when waiting stopped feeling like patience and started feeling like self-erasure. You'll hear about how small dismissals become normalized, how silence can be misread as agreement, and how preparation often begins long before anyone else notices a change. This story moves slowly on purpose, because real emotional shifts rarely announce themselves. They happen in hospital waiting rooms, in unanswered messages, in the way you stop explaining your exhaustion because no one seems to hear it anyway. And then, one day, clarity settles in, not with anger, but with certainty. I didn't stop waiting to punish anyone. I stopped waiting because I finally understood what waiting was costing me. As you listen, I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm inviting you to observe, to notice how often strength is assumed instead of supported. How often are calm women mistaken for unbreakable ones, and how absence, chosen, not imposed, can speak more clearly than any argument ever could. So before we begin, I want to ask you something gently, without pressure. Have you ever wondered who would notice if you stopped holding everything together? Before anything went wrong, before hospitals or silences or decisions that couldn't be undone, I was already playing a role, one I never formally agreed to, but fulfilled so consistently that no one thought to question it. To my husband, I was the stable center, the one who remembered insurance renewals, family obligations, birthdays, and the unspoken emotional weather of our household. I wasn't the dramatic wife or the demanding one. I didn't cry easily. I didn't threaten to leave during arguments. I listened. I adjusted. I absorbed. Over time, that made me predictable, safe, and eventually background. To friends and extended family, I was so capable. The phrase was usually said with admiration, but it carried an invisible consequence. Capable people don't need checking in on. They don't need backup. They don't need someone to sit beside them in uncomfortable places. If something went wrong, the assumption was always the same: Edith would manage. At work, I was efficient and uncomplaining, the person who knew where things were, how things worked, and what would break if no one paid attention. I rarely took credit. I didn't need recognition, I told myself. I needed things to function. And because they did, my presence became seamless, almost invisible. None of this felt cruel at the time, that's important to say. There was no obvious neglect, no single villain, just a slow accumulation of assumptions built on my consistency. When you show up without being asked, people stop asking. When you endure quietly, people assume endurance is your natural state. Even in my marriage, the story we told ourselves was flattering. We're independent, we trust each other, we don't smother. I liked that narrative. It made me feel mature, evolved, above petty emotional needs. If I needed something and didn't say it out loud, I told myself that was strength. If he didn't notice, I told myself it wasn't fair to expect mind reading. But there was another truth underneath that I hadn't named yet. I had trained everyone around me to believe my presence was optional. I was always the one who adapted. If plans changed, I adjusted. If someone was tired, I understood. If something mattered more to someone else, I stepped back. I told myself I was being generous. In hindsight, I see that I was also making myself smaller in ways that were easy to miss because they didn't look like a sacrifice. They looked reasonable. When people describe you as easy, it can be a compliment, but it can also mean they've never had to work very hard to keep you. I didn't feel invisible every day. That's not how it works. Invisibility creeps in during moments you brush past, when no one asks how your appointment went, when your silence is met with relief instead of concern, when your absence from a room doesn't shift the energy because you were never taking up space to begin with. I remember thinking, occasionally, if I stopped doing this, would anyone notice? And then immediately dismissing the thought as dramatic. I wasn't unhappy, I wasn't abused, I was just unnoticed in very specific ways. The truth is, I had become useful more than cherished, reliable more than considered. And because nothing was overtly wrong, I kept going. I told myself this was adulthood, partnership, strength. What I didn't realize then was that roles, once assigned, don't change unless something interrupts them. An interruption doesn't always come as conflict. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in a place where you expect presence, and find none. At that point in my life, though, I still believed that being steady was enough. That love didn't need to be demonstrated repeatedly. That if something truly mattered, of course, the people closest to me would show up. I hadn't yet learned how wrong that assumption could be. The first moment that stayed with me didn't announce itself as important. There was no argument attached to it, no raised voices or harsh words. In fact, if I had described it out loud, most people would have shrugged and told me I was overthinking it. That's usually how small cuts work. They rely on your own doubt to finish the job. It happened on an ordinary weekday evening. I had been feeling unwell for a few days, nothing dramatic, just a persistent discomfort that made it hard to concentrate. I mentioned it in passing while my husband scrolled through his phone. I didn't ask for anything. I wasn't seeking care or reassurance. I simply said, I might call the doctor tomorrow. He nodded, still looking at the screen, and said, okay. Not unkindly, not dismissively, just neutrally. The conversation moved on. The next day, I called the doctor. They suggested I come in sooner rather than later, just to rule a few things out. I texted my husband to let him know I had an appointment that afternoon. His response came hours later. Hope it goes well. No question, no follow-up. Again, not cruel, just think. I remember sitting in the waiting room, noticing how quiet my phone was. I told myself it didn't matter. He was busy. I hadn't asked him to come. I had chosen independence, hadn't I? That was the story I'd always told myself. When I mentioned the appointment that evening, he asked what they said, listened briefly, then returned to whatever had his attention before. The moment passed. On the surface, nothing was wrong, but something inside me paused, like a sentence left unfinished. I didn't confront him. I didn't even fully acknowledge my own reaction. I told myself I was being sensitive, that not every moment required an emotional ceremony, that this was what mature relationships looked like, two people handling their own lives side by side. But the memory stuck, not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't do. I started noticing similar moments after that. Small ones, missed check-ins, assumptions that I had things handled. A casual "you're fine" said with confidence, not concern. None of it would have raised alarms on its own. Together, they formed a quiet pattern. What struck me most was how invisible these moments were to everyone else. If I mentioned feeling tired or stretched thin, the response was always the same. You're so strong. It was meant as praise. It felt more like a dismissal. I realized that my emotional needs didn't register as needs at all. They were seen as background noise, something I could manage internally, as I always had. And because I didn't make a scene, no one thought there was a scene to be aware of. The first small cut wasn't painful in the traditional sense. It didn't bleed. It didn't demand attention. It simply altered the way I stood in the world. A subtle shift in balance. A quiet awareness that presence, when unrequested, is rarely offered. I didn't change my behavior after that. Not yet. I continued as before, reliable, composed, understanding, but somewhere in me a record had started. Not a list of grievances, but a memory of how easily my absence might go unnoticed. I think that's when I first understood something, though I didn't have words for it yet. Neglect doesn't always feel like neglect. Sometimes it feels like being trusted too much to need anything at all. And once that realization takes root, it doesn't go away. It waits. Once you notice a pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. But noticing doesn't always lead to action. Sometimes it leads to an explanation, justification, a quiet internal campaign to convince yourself that what you're feeling isn't worth naming. After that first appointment, similar moments followed. Not daily, not dramatically, but often enough to feel familiar. I would mention being overwhelmed, and the response would be logistical, not relational. Maybe take fewer projects. You're good at handling stress. It'll pass. Each sentence was reasonable on its own. Together they formed a subtle message. This isn't something I need to be present for. I told myself this was normal, that long-term relationships settle into efficiency, that emotional intensity fades, replaced by trust and autonomy. I repeated these ideas like facts, even when they felt more like excuses. There were evenings when I came home exhausted, not from work itself, but from the constant effort of holding everything together. I would sit at the kitchen table longer than necessary, hoping, quietly, that someone would notice the stillness, ask a question that didn't have a practical solution attached to it. Most nights, no one did. And so I adjusted. I spoke less about how I felt. I framed things as updates instead of experiences. I said, I have a follow-up next week, instead of, I'm scared. Not because I wanted to hide, but because history had taught me which versions of myself were easiest for others to receive. This is how normalization works. It doesn't demand your agreement. It simply rewards your silence. I became efficient even with my emotions. I sorted them privately, processed them internally, and presented only the conclusions. That way, no one had to sit with uncertainty. No one had to be uncomfortable. Least of all me, at least that's what I told myself. When friends asked how things were, I said, fine, busy. When my husband asked how my day was, I gave him the bullet points. We weren't fighting. We weren't distant in any obvious way. We were functional. And functionality, in many marriages, is mistaken for health. The truth was, I had learned to expect very little. An expectation, once lowered, reshapes your sense of what you deserve. There was a moment, small, almost forgettable, when this became clear to me. I had received test results that required further investigation. Nothing definitive, but enough to warrant concern. I told my husband that evening, choosing my words carefully, keeping my tone even. He listened, nodded, and said, let me know if you need anything. It sounded supportive. It was also a transfer of responsibility. If you need something, ask. The burden was on me to identify, articulate, and justify my need. And because I was tired, because I had learned not to push, I said, I will. Knowing I probably wouldn't, I didn't feel angry. That's important. Anger would have been easier, cleaner. What I felt instead was a kind of resignation, a quiet understanding that my emotional life was largely my own, even within a partnership. And still I stayed silent, not because I was afraid, but because I believed silence was maturity. I believed that not making demands was kindness, that self-sufficiency was a gift to others. I see now how flawed that logic was. Silence, repeated enough times, stops being generosity. It becomes erasure. By the time I recognized this, it already felt normal. That was the most unsettling part. Not the neglect itself, but how seamlessly it had integrated into my expectations, how I had adjusted my inner world to match the outer one. I didn't yet know what would interrupt this pattern. I only knew that something in me was growing tired of translating neglect into neutrality. And once that fatigue sets in, it doesn't resolve itself. It waits for a moment when silence is no longer sustainable. By the time I understood the role I was playing, it had already solidified. Roles don't usually arrive with announcements. They form slowly, through repetition, through what you tolerate, through what you quietly excel at without asking for anything in return. Mine was simple. I was the reliable one. I was the person who remembered, organized, and anticipated. If something slipped, I caught it. If someone forgot, I reminded them. If there was tension, I softened it. Over time, this made me indispensable in function and optional in presence. People trusted me to manage things, but they didn't think to manage me. In my marriage, this role was deeply ingrained. I handled appointments, schedules, and long-term planning. My husband trusted me completely in these areas. He didn't hover or interfere. At the time, I told myself that was respect. And in some ways, it was. But it was also distance disguised as confidence. I began to see how little was expected of him emotionally because so much was expected of me. If I didn't ask, nothing was offered. And because I rarely asked, the system worked. For everyone but me. There's a particular loneliness that comes from being seen as the strong one. People admire you from a distance. They assume you don't need what they need. And when you do, it feels awkward to say so, as if you're breaking character. That's what I was doing. Maintaining a character. Calm, capable, low demand. I didn't want to be a problem. I didn't want to be too much. So I made it easy to carry by carrying everything myself. No one told me this was my job. I volunteered for it. Slowly, unconsciously. And once I had proven how well I could perform it, no one thought to question whether I wanted to keep doing it. I remember a conversation with a friend around that time. She laughed and said, "You're the glue. If you ever fell apart, the rest of us would be in trouble." It was meant as a joke. I smiled. Inside, something tightened. Glue isn't meant to move. It's meant to hold others in place. I started noticing how often my needs were framed as inconveniences. Not explicitly, but subtly. A sigh, a delay, a suggestion that we talk about it later. Later, of course, it rarely came. And because I wasn't confrontational, because I didn't escalate, my dissatisfaction remained theoretical. Easy to dismiss, easy to forget. What changed wasn't an argument. It was awareness, the realization that I was valued for my function more than my presence, that my calm had become a convenience, that my silence had been interpreted as consent. This wasn't about my husband being malicious. It was about a dynamic we had both participated in. He leaned on the version of me that never asked. I maintained it because it felt safer than risking disappointment. But once you see the role clearly, you can't unsee it. You start noticing how often you're thanked for efficiency instead of care. How rarely does someone ask how you're really doing without attaching a solution? I began to understand that if I disappeared, emotionally, not physically, things would still run. Maybe not as smoothly, but they would adjust. That realization was both sobering and clarifying. I wasn't irreplaceable. I was simply convenient. And that understanding didn't make me angry. It made me quiet in a new way. Not resigned, but observant. As if I'd stepped back from the stage and started watching the play from the audience. Something in me was loosening its grip on the role I had been playing. I didn't know yet what would replace it. I only knew I was done being the glue. The day something shifted didn't come with drama. There was no argument, no breaking point that anyone else could point to later and say, "That's when it all changed." If you had been watching from the outside, you would have missed it completely. It was a hospital visit, not an emergency, not a crisis in the way people imagine them, but serious enough that I had been scheduled for additional tests, enough that the word admission had been mentioned as a possibility. I told my husband the night before. I didn't ask him to come. I said the time, the place, and the expected duration. He nodded, said he had meetings, and added, "Text me when you're done." Again, reasonable. Again, familiar. The morning of the appointment, I dressed carefully, more out of habit than intention. Neutral colors, comfortable shoes. I packed my bag with the same efficiency I applied to everything else. Documents, charger, insurance card. I noticed briefly that I was doing all of this alone. Then I dismissed the thought. This was how things were done. The waiting room was quiet in that particular way hospitals are. Muted voices, soft beeping somewhere out of sight, the smell of disinfectant that never quite fades. I checked in, took a seat, and watched other people, couples leaning toward each other, a daughter holding her mother's hand, small gestures that felt strangely loud. I sent a text to let my husband know I had arrived. No response. As time passed, I didn't feel abandoned in the dramatic sense. I felt unaccompanied. There's a difference. Abandonment is loud. Being unaccompanied is quiet, almost polite. No one has done anything wrong, and yet something essential is missing. When they called my name, I stood up alone. When the nurse asked if someone was with me, I said no automatically, without explanation. When she nodded and moved on, I felt an unexpected wave of relief. At least I didn't have to justify it. The test took longer than expected. There were questions I hadn't anticipated. Moments where I wished someone else was there, not to speak for me, just to sit. To witness, to be present without needing to fix anything. At one point, lying under bright lights, I realized something with startling clarity. If the results were bad, I would still be handling them alone. Not because my husband wouldn't care, but because the structure of our relationship had trained us both to believe I could. That realization didn't hurt the way you might expect. It didn't break me open. It settled in me, heavy and undeniable. When everything was done, I sat back in the waiting area and finally checked my phone. A message had come through. "How's it going?" Sent nearly an hour earlier. I typed "still here," then erased it, then put the phone away without responding. That was the moment. Not the hospital, not the tests. The moment I chose not to fill the silence. For the first time, I didn't explain. I didn't reassure. I didn't smooth anything over. I just sat there and let the quiet exist without managing it. I wasn't punishing him. I wasn't making a statement. I was listening to myself. And what I heard was this: I'm tired of being the only witness to my own life. When I eventually went home, everything looked the same. The house, the routine. My husband asked how it went. I answered calmly, factually. He accepted that. The day moved on, but something fundamental had shifted. Not in him, in me. I had stopped waiting for presence to arrive on its own. And once you stop waiting, you start seeing options that were always there, but never necessary before. That day didn't end my marriage, but it ended my patience with being unseen. After that hospital visit, nothing outwardly changed. That's what made the shift so effective. There were no declarations, no emotional withdrawals anyone could point to. I didn't become cold or distant in a way that would raise concern. I simply stopped compensating. Before, silence had been something that happened to me. Spaces left unfilled because no one thought to step into them. Now silence became something I chose. I noticed it first in conversations. When my husband asked how I was doing, I answered honestly, but briefly. No added context, no emotional framing to make it easier to digest. If he didn't ask follow-up questions, I didn't supply them. Not out of spite, but out of curiosity. I wanted to see what would happen if I stopped doing the emotional labor for both of us. What happened was nothing, and that told me everything. He seemed relieved, if anything. The house stayed calm, the routines held. My reduced emotional presence didn't register as absence. It was interpreted as strength, efficiency, self-sufficiency, the same traits I had always been praised for. That was when I understood how deeply my role had been internalized. Silence from me didn't create concern. It created comfort. So I leaned into it, not dramatically, quietly. I stopped reminding, stopped anticipating. If something slipped, I let it. If a plan wasn't confirmed, I didn't chase it down. I remained polite, present, functional, but no longer invisible by overextension. This wasn't passive aggression. It was an observation. I watched how often people filled the space when I didn't, how rarely they did. At work, I began documenting instead of fixing. I kept records of decisions, timelines, and dependencies. I stopped stepping in at the last minute to save projects from consequences that weren't mine to carry alone. No one accused me of slacking. They simply adjusted, slowly, imperfectly, to a version of me that was no longer buffering the system. At home, the change was subtler. My husband didn't notice what I had stopped doing, only what was still getting done. Meals appeared, bills were paid. The emotional scaffolding, however, was gone. And because it had always been invisible, its absence was difficult to name. There's a strange power in being underestimated. When people believe your silence means compliance, they stop watching closely. They assume you're stable, that nothing is shifting beneath the surface. That assumption gave me space. I used it to think, to observe, to ask myself questions I had avoided for years. What do I want? Beyond keeping things running? What would happen if I didn't intervene? What kind of life am I sustaining, and for whom? I didn't share these thoughts. I didn't need to. They were for me. Occasionally, my husband would comment, "You seem fine lately." I nodded. It was true in a way. I was fine because I had stopped expecting more than what was being offered. But there's a difference between being fine and being fulfilled. Silence made that difference. Unmistakable. He mistook my quiet for contentment. Others did too. No one sensed preparation because preparation doesn't announce itself. It looks calm, like routine, like nothing is happening at all. Inside, something was aligning, not anger, not resentment, clarity. Silence, when chosen deliberately, is not weakness. It's a pause that allows reality to speak without interference. And what reality was telling me was simple. If I continued as I was, nothing would change. If I stopped, something might. I wasn't ready to act yet, but I was no longer asleep. And that, I learned, is where real shifts begin. What they never noticed was how much room silence creates. When you stop filling every gap, you gain time. When you stop explaining yourself, you gain clarity. And when people assume you're unchanged, they stop paying attention to the details that matter. I didn't announce any kind of transformation. I didn't change my appearance or my routines in ways that would draw questions. I still went to work, still came home at roughly the same time, still asked how his day was, still listened. From the outside, I was the same woman I had always been. Internally, I had shifted into observation mode. I began paying attention to patterns I had previously smoothed over. Not emotionally, methodically. Who followed through and who relied on reminders. Who benefited from my presence and who reciprocated it. What would happen if I stepped back 1 inch instead of 10? At work, this took the form of documentation. I wrote things down that I used to hold in my head, decisions, dependencies, and informal agreements that had never made it into official channels because I was the channel. I didn't weaponize this information. I simply made it visible. To myself. The act of writing changed how I saw my value. It wasn't abstract anymore. It was traceable, concrete, measurable. I also started learning, quietly, about options I had never needed to consider because staying had always been the default. I read about financial independence, not because I planned to leave, but because I wanted to know what staying actually cost me. I reviewed shared accounts, insurance structures, and contingencies, not obsessively, calmly. This wasn't fear-driven. It was curiosity with intention. At home, I noticed how my husband interacted with the version of me that no longer preempted his needs. He didn't resist it. He didn't question it. He adapted without awareness. That adaptation told me something important. My overfunctioning had never been required. It had been convenient. There were moments when I almost spoke up, when I considered saying, "Do you notice what's different?" But I didn't. I was no longer interested in teaching anyone how to see me. I wanted to know what they would do without instruction. I also noticed myself changing in subtler ways. I slept better. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head. I felt less urgency to resolve emotional ambiguity. The quiet I had chosen was giving me back energy I hadn't realized I was spending. No one commented on this, that was the point. Preparation doesn't look like plotting. It looks like alignment, like removing noise so you can hear your own thoughts clearly. I wasn't planning an exit. I was preparing for the agency. I asked myself difficult questions and didn't rush to answer them. If nothing changed, could I live like this indefinitely? If something did change, what would I need to feel grounded rather than reactive? I began to understand that the power I had been missing wasn't external. It wasn't leverage over someone else. It was the ability to choose without needing permission or validation. They never noticed because I didn't need them to. The irony is that had anyone truly checked in, really checked in, I might have paused. Not because I was looking to be convinced, but because presence invites honesty. Absence invites evaluation. And evaluation was happening quietly, steadily, without witnesses. By the time anyone might have sensed a shift, the groundwork would already be laid. Not for confrontation, for certainty. Because the most decisive changes rarely announce themselves. They arrive fully formed, after all the thinking has already been done. The reveal didn't come with adrenaline. There was no rush, no triumphant realization, no moment where I felt clever or vindicated. What I felt instead was a deep, almost unsettling calm. It happened on a quiet Sunday afternoon, the kind of day that looks empty on the surface, but holds weight if you let it. I was reviewing documents, nothing secretive, nothing hidden. Just information I had always technically had access to, but never a reason to examine closely before. That's often how leverage works. It isn't hidden, it's ignored. I noticed patterns in our shared finances first. Not discrepancies or wrongdoing, just dependencies. Systems that relied on my consistency, my follow-through, my memory. I had always been the one who tracked deadlines, renewals, and long-term obligations. Not because I was asked to, but because I did it well. Seeing it laid out clearly changed something in me. Not fear, not power. Perspective. If I stepped back, things wouldn't collapse. But they wouldn't run smoothly either, and the adjustments required wouldn't be emotional, they'd be structural. That distinction mattered. I also recognized that something else, something harder to articulate. My husband's sense of stability was partially built on my quiet presence, not my affection, not my support, my management. That realization wasn't flattering, it wasn't cruel, it was simply accurate. I didn't celebrate this awareness. I didn't feel superior. In fact, I felt a kind of grief. For the years I had mistaken indispensability for intimacy, for how easily love can blur into logistics if you're not careful. The real reveal, though, wasn't about money or systems. It was about me. I realized that I was no longer afraid of being alone, not because I wanted solitude, but because I had already been practicing it in small, invisible ways for a long time. Emotional independence had quietly become emotional isolation, and I had survived it. That survival changed the equation. I saw clearly that I had options, real ones, and that I didn't need to rush into any of them. Leverage, I learned, isn't about control. It's about freedom of movement. I didn't confront my husband with this knowledge. There was no reason to. Confrontation would have turned clarity into conflict, and I wasn't interested in conflict. Instead, I sat with the understanding. I let it settle. I asked myself what kind of life I wanted with this information, not because of it. The answer wasn't immediate, but the noise was gone. I stopped feeling anxious about the future, not because it was secure, but because I was no longer unprepared. That's a different kind of safety. The private reveal wasn't something I could share. It wasn't meant to be shared. It was a shift in internal posture, a straightening of the spine, a quiet, irreversible awareness that I could stand on my own without burning anything down. And once you know that, you don't need to prove it. I didn't act that day, or the next. There was no urgency. Clarity doesn't rush. It waits until action is no longer emotional. I went back to my life, the routines, the conversations, the calm. Nothing looked different. That was the most telling part, because the most important changes had already happened, and they were invisible to everyone but me. Clarity doesn't force you to act. It simply removes your excuses for not acting. Once I understood my position, emotionally, structurally, personally, I entered a phase that felt strangely suspended. Nothing was urgent. Nothing was chaotic. But everything was real in a way it hadn't been before. I began listing options, not dramatically, not as ultimatums, just possibilities. I could stay exactly as things were, now with the benefit of awareness. Accept the marriage as functional, emotionally minimalist, and largely self-directed. There was safety in that option, familiarity. No upheaval. I could try to renegotiate the dynamic, initiate conversations about presence, expectations, and emotional availability. That path required vulnerability and risk. It also required a willingness on both sides to see what had been invisible for years. Or I could choose something else, not necessarily leaving immediately, but disengaging from the version of myself that made the imbalance sustainable. That was the irreversible choice. I didn't decide to leave my husband that day. I decided to stop structuring my life around being the easiest person to be married to. It sounds subtle. It wasn't. Once that decision was made, I couldn't unknow it. I couldn't go back to smoothing things over, to carrying emotional weight in silence, to treating my needs as optional accessories. The decision wasn't outward, it was internal. And internal decisions are the hardest to reverse. I watched how the options felt in my body. Staying as I was felt heavy. Negotiation felt uncertain, but possible. Disengagement felt calm, not cold, calm. I chose calm. That choice meant accepting that things might not improve, that my husband might never fully see what I had been carrying, and that if I needed him to become someone else in order for me to be okay, I was already too far gone. This wasn't a resignation, it was alignment. I stopped imagining conversations where I explained everything perfectly, and he finally understood. Those fantasies had been a form of waiting, and I was done waiting. Instead, I asked myself a different question. What would my life look like if I didn't need to be witnessed in order to choose myself? The answer was quieter than I expected. It looked like autonomy, like space, like decisions made without emotional negotiation. It looked like not needing permission to rest, to step back, to prioritize my own stability. That's when I knew the choice was irreversible, not because it was dramatic, but because it changed the foundation of how I related to myself. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't owe anyone a declaration. I simply began orienting my life around the assumption that I was my own primary responsibility. Everything that followed flowed from that assumption. There was no guilt. There was grief, briefly, for what might have been. But grief didn't derail me. It clarified what I was no longer willing to trade away. The decision point wasn't a crossroads with flashing signs. It was a quiet line I stepped over, alone. And once crossed, there was no going back to the person who waited. Once the decision was made, movement followed naturally. Not hurried, not secretive in a dramatic sense, just deliberate. I didn't announce changes because I didn't need permission to make them. And I didn't rush because urgency often attracts attention. Silence, on the other hand, creates room to act without interference. I began with practical things. Small adjustments that looked like responsibility, not rebellion. I separated tasks that had always lived only in my head into systems that didn't depend on my constant presence. Not as a favor and not as a threat, just as an acknowledgement that shared lives should not require one invisible manager. I reviewed finances carefully. Again, nothing hidden, nothing extreme. I educated myself fully. I ensured I understood our options, our obligations, and our contingencies. Knowledge has a stabilizing effect when you're no longer operating on hope. At work, I continued to shift from savior to contributor. I did my job well. I did not do everyone else's. The consequences were not dramatic, a few delays, a few awkward moments, nothing catastrophic, but enough to prove something important. The world did not fall apart when I stopped over-functioning. At home, my husband didn't notice the shifts as actions. He experienced them as an atmosphere. I was calm, I was less reactive, less available for emotional buffering. I didn't create conflict, but I also didn't absorb it. This is what moving in silence looks like. Not plotting, not withdrawing love, just removing yourself from positions that require you to disappear in order to be useful. He still assumed I was fine. That assumption gave me freedom. People don't interrupt what they believe is stable. I began setting boundaries that didn't need explanations. If I needed time alone, I took it. If I didn't have the energy to manage something, I didn't. I allowed small discomforts to exist without rushing to resolve them. None of this was announced, and because it wasn't challenged. The most surprising part was how peaceful this phase felt. I wasn't angry, I wasn't resentful, I wasn't waiting for anything to change. I was simply acting in accordance with the truth I had already accepted. Silence protected that truth. Had I spoken too soon, I might have been pulled back into negotiation, into promises, into a temporary change that required my constant vigilance to sustain. I wasn't interested in that. I wanted to see what reality looked like when I stopped propping it up. And reality responded predictably. Some things adjusted, some didn't, some gaps widened, and in those gaps, clarity grew. Moving in silence wasn't about secrecy. It was about sovereignty, about reclaiming my internal space before anyone else could weigh in. By the time anyone might have sensed a shift, it would already be complete. Consequences rarely arrive as punishment. More often, they arrive in confusion. The first signs weren't dramatic confrontations or accusations. There were pauses, missed connections. Small inefficiencies that used to be absorbed quietly by me now had nowhere to land. At work, questions started surfacing. Not about my performance, I was still doing everything required of me, but about processes that no longer resolved themselves automatically. People had to follow up, to wait, to take responsibility for details they had once assumed would be handled. No one blamed me. They couldn't. I hadn't failed. I had simply stopped compensating. At home, the effects were more subtle and more telling. My husband began asking logistical questions he had never asked before, where certain documents were kept, when renewals were due, what the plan was for things I had always quietly managed. I answered when asked, neutrally, without irritation, but I didn't preemptively organize or remind. He seemed unsettled, though he couldn't have said why. The stability he relied on was still there, but it felt thinner, less buffered. Emotionally, there was a shift too. He checked in more often, not deeply, but more frequently. "Everything okay?" he would ask. I would answer honestly, "Yes," and I meant it. I was okay. What he felt, I think, was the absence of something he had never consciously acknowledged before. The emotional cushioning, the quiet reassurance that someone else was holding the edges. People are often most aware of loss when it's undefined, when they can't name what's missing, only that something feels off. Friends noticed it too in passing. I was less available, less inclined to step in. I listened, but I didn't rescue. I offered perspective, not solutions. A few people commented that I seemed different, calmer, more self-contained. None of them connected this to a choice. They assumed it was a phase. That assumption protected me. The consequences weren't explosive, they were cumulative. A growing awareness in others that the systems they leaned on were no longer invisible. That effort had weight. That presence mattered. I watched all of this without satisfaction. There was no sense of now they'll see. That wasn't the point. I wasn't waiting for recognition. I was measuring sustainability. Could I continue like this? Present, calm, no longer self-erasing? The answer was yes, and that answer mattered more than anyone else's reaction. My husband didn't confront me. He didn't ask what had changed. In a way, that was his answer. It told me that as long as things weren't openly broken, there was no urgency to examine them. That emotional absence was tolerable if the surface remained smooth. That realization closed a door for me, gently without force. The consequences had begun, not as a lesson to anyone else, but as confirmation to me. Confirmation that my presence had been more significant than my personhood, and that stepping back revealed truths that stepping forward never could. Nothing could be undone now, not because of damage, but because of knowledge. Once you see what happens when you stop holding everything together, you can't unsee it. By the time the concern became visible, the window for repair had already narrowed. It didn't arrive as a confession or a heartfelt apology. It arrived as unease. My husband started hovering in small ways, asking questions that they didn't quite know what they were looking for. "You've been quiet lately. You seem different." The tone wasn't accusatory. It was uncertain, as if he sensed movement but couldn't locate its source. I answered honestly but minimally. "I've been thinking." "I'm fine." Each response was true. Each one also marked a boundary I no longer crossed. What he was experiencing wasn't loss yet. It was disorientation, the kind that happens when something essential has shifted, but you can't identify what lever was pulled. He suggested we take a weekend away, that we reset. It was the first time in a long while that he initiated something emotional rather than practical. I noticed it. I appreciated the effort. And I also recognized it for what it was. A reaction, not a reckoning. I didn't refuse. I didn't agree either. I said I'd think about it. That answer landed heavier than any argument would have, because it introduced a reality he hadn't considered before. My compliance was no longer automatic. There was a brief period where he tried to be more attentive, asking how appointments went, checking in at the end of the day, sitting closer on the couch. It was earnest, and it came too late. Not because the gestures were wrong, but because they were sudden. Sustained presence is built slowly. Panic presence arrives all at once. I could feel the difference in my body. These efforts didn't soothe me. They exhausted me. They asked me to reopen something I had already closed internally. I think that's the hardest part for the person who arrives late to awareness. They believe intensity can make up for absence. That attention, once focused, can rewind time. It can't. I didn't confront him with a list of moments. I didn't explain the years of quiet adjustments. I didn't want him to understand. I wanted him to see that understanding was no longer the requirement. He asked one night, carefully, "Is there something I should be worried about?" I looked at him and felt no urge to soften the truth. "I'm not worried," I said. "That's the difference." That was the moment the panic surfaced, not loudly, but unmistakably. His face changed, not with anger, with realization. He had mistaken my calm for stability, and now he was seeing that calm could also mean detachment. There were conversations after that, attempts to rewind, to promise presence, to suggest therapy, all reasonable, all too late, not in timing but in orientation. Because the version of me those solutions were meant for no longer exists. I wasn't angry, I wasn't closed. I was finished waiting, and waiting is the only currency that keeps certain dynamics alive. Once it's gone, there's nothing left to trade. By the time he understood what was at stake, the decision had already been made, not against him, but for myself. And decisions made in clarity don't reverse under pressure. What he felt as loss, I felt as completion. There was nothing left to fix because nothing was broken anymore. It had simply reached its limit. When the conversation finally happened, it didn't feel like a confrontation. There was no spike in emotion, no rehearsed speeches, no raised voices. It felt more like a closing than an opening. We were sitting at the dining table. No special occasion, no tension in the air that an outsider could detect. He asked quietly, "Are you still in this?" It was the most honest question he had asked in years. I didn't answer immediately. Not to create drama, but because I wanted to be precise. Words matter when they're final. I've been in it alone for a long time, I said. My voice was steady, not defensive, not sharp, just factual. He tried to respond, to explain, to contextualize, to point out moments when he had been present. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I wasn't keeping score. When he finished, I said, "I believe you," and it still wasn't enough. That was hard for him to hear. I could see it. Not because it was cruel, but because it didn't invite negotiation. There was no accusation to defend against, no misunderstanding to correct. He asked what he could do now. That was the question that told me everything. Not what I needed. Why hadn't I said something sooner? Just what could he do now? As if this were a problem to be solved rather than a reality to be accepted. I answered honestly. "Nothing you do now would be for me," I said. "It would be to ease your fear." The room went quiet. I didn't say this to punish him. I said it because it was true. And truth, when spoken calmly, has weight. He asked if I had already decided. "Yes," I said. "A while ago." That didn't mean I had planned every step. It meant the internal decision, the one that matters, had been made. The rest was logistics. He asked why I hadn't said anything sooner. I told him the truth again. Because every time I needed to be seen, I learned to be quieter instead. And you accepted that version of me without question. There was no anger in my voice, only clarity. He looked at me like someone realizing the map they've been using is outdated. Like they've been walking confidently in the wrong direction for a long time. We talked for a while after that, about practical things, about respect, about what we both wished had been different. It was the most honest conversation we had ever had. And it came at the end. There was no emotional explosion because explosions require pressure. I had already released mine. When the conversation ended, there was sadness, mutual, quiet, but there was also relief because nothing was being held in place by denial anymore. I didn't feel victorious. I felt complete. That's what confrontation without heat gives you. Not drama, not closure in the cinematic sense, but alignment between what you know and how you live. And once that alignment is there, you don't need to raise your voice to be heard. After everything was said, after the logistics were outlined and the future took on a new, quieter shape, I expected to feel untethered, lost, as if a large part of my identity had been removed, leaving a hollow space behind. That isn't what happened. What I felt was stillness. Not the empty kind, but the grounded kind, the kind that comes when you stop bracing yourself. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't anticipating someone else's needs before my own. I wasn't editing myself for ease of consumption. I wasn't scanning the room for what needed to be managed. I was just there. Who I am now is not radically different from who I was before. I'm still calm, still thoughtful, still capable, but those qualities no longer come at the cost of my presence. I no longer confuse reliability with love, or silence with maturity. I understand now that being low maintenance is not a virtue if it requires you to disappear. I've learned to notice how my body responds to situations. If I feel myself shrinking, accommodating too quickly, overriding my own signals, that's information. I listen to it now. I don't rationalize it away. There's no bitterness in this version of me. Bitterness would mean I'm still fighting something. I'm not. I've accepted what was real without needing to rewrite it as malicious or tragic. My marriage wasn't a failure. It was a dynamic that reached its limit. That distinction matters. I still believe in connection. I still believe in partnership. But I no longer believe that endurance is the same thing as intimacy, or that love should require you to be endlessly understanding at the expense of being understood. The quiet dominance people talk about, it isn't about control over others. It's about self-possession, about knowing that you don't need to suffer to justify change, that you can leave a room without slamming the door and still be decisive. I don't wait the way I used to. I don't assume people will notice what I don't name, and I don't take responsibility for gaps that aren't mine to fill. That doesn't make me harder. It makes me honest. If someone shows up now, they meet me where I am, not where I've made myself small enough to be convenient. And if they don't, I don't translate that absence into self-doubt. I let it be what it is. This version of me is quieter, but not less. softer in some ways, sharper in others. Most of all, she's present in her own life, and that presence is not negotiable. There's a certain kind of strength that never announces itself. It doesn't argue, it doesn't demand apologies, it doesn't try to win. It simply stops participating in dynamics that require self-erasure to survive. That's the strength of this story. Not the moment someone leaves, but the moment someone stops waiting. If there's a moral here, it isn't that people are cruel or that love inevitably fails. It's that silence has consequences, especially when it's mistaken for agreement. When you consistently absorb more than you're given, others will assume the balance is fair because nothing is visibly breaking. But something is. Absence can be louder than arguments, not because it punishes, but because it reveals. When you stop cushioning the world for others, reality has a way of showing exactly what your presence was worth. I didn't leave to teach a lesson. I didn't withdraw to provoke guilt. I stepped away because I understood something clearly at last. Waiting had become a way of postponing my own life. No one is obligated to meet needs they don't know exist. But when your needs are consistently invisible, the responsibility shifts. Not to speak louder, but to decide whether silence is still serving you. Sometimes the most honest response isn't another conversation. It's alignment. It's living in a way that no longer requires you to explain why you're tired or lonely or quietly done. This kind of ending doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with relief, with the calm of no longer negotiating your worth in rooms that benefit from you being easy. If you're listening to this and feeling something stir, not anger, but recognition, I want you to know this. You don't need a dramatic reason to choose yourself. You don't need permission. You don't need to prove how much you endured. You're allowed to stop waiting simply because you're ready to live differently. And if someone only notices your value once you step back, that tells you everything you need to know. So I'll leave you with one question, not as a challenge, but as an invitation. What might change in your life if you stopped waiting to be seen and started acting on what you already know? Thank you for listening.
Cảm ơn bạn đã theo dõi. Hãy bấm đăng ký và bật chuông để luôn cập nhật nội dung mới. Hẹn gặp lại.